Welcome back. Today I am here with another fantasy recommendation video. I really love fantasy and I read a lot of it, so I've been making a series of videos where I curate recommendations of different types of fantasy or tropes in fantasy that you might be looking for. In today's video, I'm going to be recommending to you 10 of my favorite feminist fantasy novels. And when I say feminist, I mean a variety of things with this. This includes some things that are just sort of casually feminist in the way that the world is built and the way that the characters are displayed. I mean things that are much more obviously feminist in terms of their themes, and also books where sisterhood becomes kind of a central thing over and above romance. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into these. First, I have a couple of books that I want to recommend to you that I think do a really good job of emphasizing sisterhood and strong female friendships, which I think is deeply feminist in a lot of ways and wonderful. The first book that I want to recommend is one of my favorites from last year and a book that I think is really underhyped and underappreciated that I wish more people would go out and read, and that is Sweet Black Waves by Kristina Perez. This was a debut novel last year, and it is a dark, witchy, feminist retelling of Tristan and Isolde. I really loved everything about this. It's told from the perspective of Isolde's lady's maid, Branwen, and it's really, really interesting. It plays with a lot of these ideas of the witch and the way that that is associated with women and kind of questions a lot of these gendered norms that we have. But also at its core, this is really a book about sisterhood. It's clear that the most important relationship to Branwen is her friendship with her cousin Isolde, who's almost like a sister to her. And it's a really strong female friendship that you see throughout the book. And so I'm gonna recommend Sweet Black Waves. I love this book and I wish more people would go pick it up. The next book I want to recommend is the first in one of my favorite YA epic fantasy series, and that is Truthwitch by Susan Dennard. This is the UK hardcover edition, which I thought I would show off because my dear friend Leanna over Leanna's library sent it to me recently, and I'm still so happy that I have this. The Witchland series, I think, is really brilliant as an epic fantasy series, and it's one that I often recommend to people who are looking to cross over into adult epic fantasy because I think it's got a lot of very similar things. While the characters in this story are younger, a lot of the ways that the story is told and the ways that Susan approaches her writing craft are more typical of adult epic fantasy, and it's part of why I love it so much. It is a multi-perspective story, but the thing that really holds it together, especially in this first book, and the core of this, is a friendship. It's the relationship between Safi and Isolde, who are thread sisters, which means kind of lifelong strong female friends. There are romances and they do get separated through the series and kind of have their own growth and character arcs, but ultimately they really deeply love each other and care for each other, and that's something that really pushes a lot of the action, especially in book one in the series. So I'm going to recommend Truthwitch by Susan Dennard. Next, I want to recommend a couple of books that are sort of casually feminist in some ways. The first one is another of my favorite books from last year, and that is Furyborn by Legrand. This is another kind of epic fantasy story. It's about two queens 1,000 years apart, and one is destined to be evil and one is destined to be the savior, and we're not necessarily sure which is which, and it switches back and forth between their perspectives. I love this. It deals a lot with what it means to have fate and female agency and the decisions that we make, and has a lot of complex female characters, which I think is a deeply feminist thing to write about in and of itself, to have messy girls who are allowed to make mistakes and not always do things perfectly, and that that's okay. The other thing is that I think just the world building and the way that Legrand creates this fantasy world is casually feminist in these really interesting ways. And you kind of pick up these little things throughout it. For example, there's kind of a brief description at one point when they're in a castle that there is a men's harem and a women's harem, and so it's sort of like equal opportunity oppression. It's not like a gendered thing, and I just kind of appreciated that. I mean, obviously there's still really bad things that happen in this world and there are different forms of oppression, but gender is not the thing that is driving it, and so I just appreciated that in terms of like this casually feminist underpinning to the way that the world is created and the way that the story is being told. So I'm going to recommend Furyborn by Legrand. I also want to recommend to you the Queen's Thief series by Whalen Turner, and in particular, The Queen of Attolia. This is probably my favorite book in the series. I think it's book 2. The reason is that the Queen of Attolia, this one of the main characters that we get in here, is such a fascinating, complex female character who is a really amazing ruler and is ruthless when she needs to be, and I don't know, she's just really, really interesting. And especially for the time that this was written, I'm so impressed that she was writing female characters like this, because it wasn't something we were getting as much of. This was published in the year 2000, and I love it. Honestly, I love the entire series and recommend it for people. Especially, I would say, if you like political intrigue and like political thrillers with a fantasy element, like that's really what these are. They have some interesting characters, but they're less character driven, and there's a lot of political machinations and reveals that happen throughout the plot that I think are really interesting. But I just love the way she draws the female characters, especially the queens in these books. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And the nice thing about this series is it's something that is really appropriate for a lot of different ages. This is something I would feel comfortable giving to like a 12 or 13-year-old in terms of content, but it's complex enough and well written enough that I think even adults will appreciate it, even though they're relatively quick books to get through. So I'm recommending the Queen's Thief series, but particularly The Queen of Attolia, which is book 2. The next book that I want to recommend, I just love a lot. I think I've mentioned this in one other video as well. The reason that I placed it here is because it's a book that's really about female agency and pushing back against the expectations that are placed on you from the outside. And that is Three Dark Crowns by Kendare Blake. Also, this is a book with complex female characters, which I really love, where they're morally gray, they're messy, and I think I really enjoy reading about women like that because it feels more real to me. So Three Dark Crowns is this wonderful dark YA fantasy novel about 3 sisters who, when they turn 16, have to compete for the crown and basically kill each other, and the last one standing gets the crown. And so they are all turning 16 and these things are starting, and it's really interesting. They have really interesting relationships with each other, and it's interesting seeing the way that they understand themselves and the people around them, and the ways that they either give into or push back in very different ways against the expectations that are being placed on them. So I love this for that as like a feminist pick that's about female empowerment and different visions of feminism, and also different visions of what it looks like to resist. That resistance might not look the same depending on who it's coming from. Moving on with some other books that I think do a great job of showcasing different types of feminine strength and the agency that goes with them. There's a book that I love that I, again, wish more people would talk about and read because I love this. I need to continue on with the series, but this is Before She Ignites by Jodi Meadows. I loved this book. It's really interesting. It's a fantasy novel written into time periods, and you get some flashbacks to our main character's life before, and then her current life while she's in prison. And it's really interesting. It's a very character-driven novel, so for people who want like a lot of plot and action, this is probably going to be too slow, but I am a big fan of character-driven novels. If you've watched my channel for any length of time, you've probably come to discover that, and this is a really great character study. The other thing that I think is super interesting about this is that our main character here deals with severe anxiety and experiences panic attacks, so she's got mental health things that she is wrestling with, and that is depicted, I think, really, really well. And yet we see her have strength in the midst of that and see her find her way to her own agency. Even though she's not this like brash character, she's still a strong woman, and she's strong not just in spite of, but in some ways because of the challenges that she faces with her mental health. And so I think this is a really, really great book. I recommend it. Similar in terms of this theme of like pushing back against societal expectations, which I think is a big thing that I like. I like seeing these women who make their own way in the world and are allowed to be messy and allowed to make mistakes, but know what they want and go after it, even if it's not what other people want for them. And another example is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. This is, again, another series that I need to finish, but this is the first book in the series, and it is another just beautifully written, lush, darker fantasy world inspired by Russian history and folklore, and our main character is a girl who wants more than what she's told that she's allowed to have because she's a woman. And it's about her finding her agency and finding her strength even in the midst of a lot of oppression and a lot of gendered dynamics that tell her that she can only be one thing. And that is sometimes painful to see, that it's not without blowback. But yeah, I really love this one as well. It's beautiful. My next recommendation for you is Reign the Earth by A.C. Gaughen. So this is a new adult fantasy novel that deals with domestic abuse and domestic violence, and I love it. I love the way that it's handled. We get, again, a really interesting vision of what feminine strength might look like and of what it might mean to be a woman and be a woman who makes your own path and sacrifices for family. I think this is such a powerful book, and I think an important book about cycles of abuse and what keeps people in them and what might eventually help them to get out of it, but set in a fantasy world where there is magic. And so I think this is another really important book, and definitely in many ways a feminist book. All right, I have 2 more recommendations for you. The first one is The Bells by Dhonielle Clayton. I really enjoyed this book. It's a super interesting one. She does so many interesting things in terms of themes in this one. This is really a book that deconstructs our notions of beauty and what constitutes beauty and what women go through to try to be beautiful, and the things that parents and mothers put on their children in terms of pressure to be beautiful or look a certain way. And this kind of takes that apart. It is set in a world that's loosely inspired by New Orleans, and it's about the Bells, who are these beautiful women who are able to change people's physical appearance to make them look beautiful. But it's a really painful process and an expensive process. And so you get a lot here about privilege and class and gender and oppression, and like I said, these beauty norms that are problematic and how destructive those can be. So I love this. Again, it's something that I think is addressing some really important issues that is pro-women and very empowering. So I'm going to recommend The Bells by Dhonielle Clayton. Okay, and finally, I'm going to recommend what might be the most controversial book on this list. If you're interested in hearing more detailed thoughts on this book, I will link my review of it up above. I do have a full review of this book because it's been quite a polarizing one, but one that I loved and one that I think is really important. This is Damsel by Elana K. Arnold. Damsel is interesting because I think in a lot of ways what it actually is feminist horror dressed up like a fairy tale. So I'm putting this in a list of fantasy recommendations videos, but I think that in a lot of ways the fantasy here is window dressing of what is actually horror. In a lot of ways. It's really horrific, the things that go on. It follows a young woman who wakes up naked on horseback with a prince carrying her and no memory of her past life, and him telling her that he saved her from the dragon and now she is going to go off and be his bride. And this is a book that deals with toxic masculinity and rape culture and all of the things that go along with that. It is a very dark book. There are multiple scenes of sexual harassment and sexual assault, so if that is a triggering thing for you, then maybe don't pick it up. But I absolutely loved it. I thought it was really important. I loved the ending. I think this is probably the most, like, I don't know, I almost want to say like militantly feminist book on this list. It's not really militant, but like really, really feminist. And I loved it. I think it is worth picking up if you're not going to be bothered by the content in it. I do think it's well worth reading. So there you go. Those are my 10 recommendations of my favorite feminist fantasy novels. I know there are more than this, but these are some of the ones on my shelves that I love the most and want to recommend to you. Talk to me in the comments down below and let me know any of your thoughts. And if you have any recommendations of feminist fantasy novels that you think people might be interested in or I might be interested in, please list them below because I'm sure there are people looking for even more than this. And for your question of the day to be entered into my bi-monthly giveaway, let me know which of the books that I talked about today is either your favorite if you have read it, or is one that you are most interested in reading after hearing me talk about it, because I'm always really curious to know how you react to the way that I talk about stuff. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.